Tanse, Oblatkud, bonjour, good morning. Lorena Fontaine is an associate professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Winnipeg. Professor Fontaine has taught at the First Nations University of Canada and the School of Public Policy graduate program at Queen's University, and has worked with Aboriginal political organizations for 20 years. Since 2003, Professor Fontaine has been an advocate for Aboriginal residential school survivors, as well as children of residential schools survivors. In addition to her extensive advocacy and scholarship on residential schools, Professor Fontaine has acted as an equality rights panel member on the Court Challenges program and has been involved with the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund. Please join me in welcoming our opening keynote, Professor Lorena Fontaine.
Abushu maigan gije kondishnikaz maigan and dudem. Abide mide zaging opaskuyak and donjiba. I would just like to say how grateful I am to be speaking to you this morning here on Treaty 6. And I'd like to thank the elder for the prayer this morning to set us on a good path as we talk about reconciliation over the next couple of days. I just want to tell you before I start talking about the framework that I have been working on with some elders in my community. When I was asked to come and speak today, I was very honored and excited, and I assumed that I would be speaking on one of the panels, and when I asked for direction of what I should focus my talk on, the conference organizers asked me to provide some words to help set the tone of the conference, and I was a bit overwhelmed by this daunting task. So I asked my mother for advice on what I should talk about, and all she told me was not to be boring. So my objective today is not to bore you and to provide some words to help set us on some important discussions that we're going to be sharing over the next couple of days. So when I should also introduce myself. I'm from the Saugeen First Nation in Manitoba. On my mother's side, we're from the Opaskwayak Cree Nation in northern Manitoba. So on my father's side, we're Ojibwe from the Treaty 1 area. And on my mother's side, we're from the Treaty 5 area in northern Manitoba. And we, in my family, our ancestral languages are Ojibwe and Swampy Cree. So when I started preparing for this talk today, I decided to go home and speak to elders from my community because reconciliation is a term that's often used today in our discussions about law and healing, particularly because of the release of the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I'm always interested to find out what reconciliation means to people, because there's different ways of talking about it. So I framed my topic today around the concept of reconciliation, but from a Cree perspective, from the elders from my community. So what we did in preparation for this is myself and some of the elders were talking about the idea of relationships and broken relationships and the restoration of relationships. And we found that there was no actual word for reconciliation. So we went through a few hours of deliberation, and we came up with a concept to talk about reconciliation, which I'm going to reveal in a second here. We talked about, to come up with this concept, we had to talk about the harms in our community and the goals of trying to fix those harms. We also talked about how harm can be about an individual, about a family, and about a community, and about a nation, and about our relationship with Canada. And what we decided to do is to frame this concept that I'm going to talk about in a second, Kwayeskatasowin, in terms of individual harms, family harms, community harms, and the harm that Indigenous people face with Canada. And this concept that they came up with is called setting things right. In the process of coming up with this concept, I realized what we were doing was really the work of what jurolinguists do today. And this is a term that I wasn't familiar with up until a little while ago. And this term came up in the 1980s when legislative drafters were drafting legislation. They were assisting with the translation of legislation. And drafters in this country deal with two different languages and two systems of law, often two systems of law. In Canada, we also have over 60 Indigenous languages that come from 12 language families. And within those languages are different systems of law as well. So when we're talking about Indigenous law, we're talking about many laws of different peoples in this country. And the elders really wanted me to emphasize that. So what I'm bringing to you today is not an Indigenous legal concept, but a Cree concept from my community about reconciliation. The other thing that I wanted to just set here before I talk about the concept is I attended a Knowledge Keepers conference. So part of the framework that I'm talking about comes from the elders from my community, but also some of the knowledge that I learned in attending this Knowledge Keepers conference that the TRC put on in 2014. And what the commissioners said at the start of this conference is that they had heard from thousands of survivors and many intergenerational survivors of the residential schools. And what they found was that from the voices of many survivors and Aboriginal youth, that reconciliation will take place when the languages and the cultures are revived. For survivors, their focus was on children, their grandchildren and children, and the importance of reviving the culture, learning about how they can use their culture in their lives to come to terms with the past and to come to terms with their responsibilities for the future. Many young Aboriginal people talked in public forums about the answers that they saw in terms of reconciliation. And many of them talked about Indigenous languages and cultures as well, and that they wanted to put that into their lives so that their children can grow up with the tools necessary to be able to be strong human beings in society and participate in a way that was intended for them. During the gathering, most elders spoke in their ancestral languages about reconciliation, but not one of them had a word for reconciliation. They used stories from their families, our oral history. They used teachings and personal experiences and observations to discuss reconciliation. I'm going to use a bit of what they said at this conference about this, and also the elders' teachings from my community, to talk about this framework. So we started off with the concept of Wahkohtowin, about kinship and how everything is interrelated. and how that these relationships have been broken, and the consequences of what happens when these relationships are broken, and how we go about setting things right. So, Kwayeskatasowin. I'm going to start with Wahkohtowin and talk about it in a story that an elder shared at this gathering. And it's called The Eagle Story, or The Story of Two Roads. And it was given by an elder by the name of Mary Dellery from Ontario. And she talked about this story being passed on to her from an elder in her community when she was little. And it talks about relationships in a different kind of way. She starts off by saying that we need to talk about our relationships to one another and our responsibilities as Anishinaabe people or Cree people, because our first responsibility is to ourselves and our nations of peoples. We also have another responsibility, the responsibility we have for this land, our land and all our relatives on this land. So that includes the people, the water, the animals, the plants. We also have another responsibility on our lands, and that's to our relatives. And she talked about our relatives not just being our immediate relatives, but our extended relatives, and also the new people that came to this land. We have a responsibility and a relationship to all these people and our relatives who have come to share the land with us. And the story or the teaching about the two roads is where we stand as people, and the relationship that we have comes from the four directions. And when people came across the waters to this territory, we recognized in that first meeting, in that first gathering, that we must have the four directions with us in establishing those relationships. And those directions come from our Creator. And they also talked that the new people that came to our lands also had their own four directions that they brought to this land. Our ancestors recognized that when our relatives came from across the waters, that they established a relationship with these four directions, their four directions and our four directions. But we only understand ours. We know that we treat each other in a certain way. We treat each other with honesty. We treat each other in a sharing way. We treat each other with strength, and we treat each other with kindness. And that's our four directions. There was a break in the relationships and these values when newcomers came. And we see the break in Pasdamowin, the relationships, and Ochinanen, the consequence of those relationships that are broken. And we have evidence of this. We have ample evidence about what these broken relationships are, where they stem from, and the consequences of that. We see that in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. We have the TRC report. We have dozens of reports and commissions and studies that document the harms and the consequences. But how do we set things right again is something that we often talk about in our communities and us as people in a country. And I asked the elders, so when we get to this point, what do we do? And I was reminded of when I was little and I would go to my grandparents and I had done something wrong, and I would tell them about it, and their answer to me was always, "Mas Kwayeskatasowin, apokina." What they told me was that what I've done was not right, and that it's up to me, it's my responsibility to set things right. And And the elders reiterated that to me when we're talking about Kwayeskatasowin, that it's our responsibility to repair the relationships, and the onus is on us. And nobody is going to take that responsibility to decide what to do to correct the situation, the harms that have been done. We have a moral obligation to repair the harms. And part of our ability to find solutions in that is part of our teaching. The teaching to find the solution to repair the harms that have been done in our communities. Our languages are very important, not just because of the words we speak, it's also because of the legal concepts that we have. And these legal concepts define values, they instruct behavior, and they instruct relationships. The elders say without our languages, we can't define the right relationships adequately, and those relationships that have kept our community stables for generations. So they're also saying that we're not just talking about law in terms of concepts, but we're also talking about concepts that instruct behavior. The elders said that with the language, people knew their place in our communities and how they functioned in a community. Today, we don't know our relatives, and we don't know how to relate to one another. And as I turn to this concept of Kwayeskatasowin, I asked them about these two legal systems and these two values that we have, the four directions and the values that we have as peoples. And they said that we have many languages, but we also have many legal systems in Canada. For the Cree, the Swampy Cree in my region, we had a natural law that informed us how to survive. And those laws are still very important in how we go about our daily lives and how we go about working with people in our communities, our families, and with Canada. We now have a Western legal system. And the elders said that the Western legal system that we have to work with, in their view, is not about relationships. This was their teaching to me. It's about how we relate to law. And we need to find ways to bridge the two. So we need to find ways to work with the relationships, but also how we use law to be able to do that. They also said something kind of surprising that I had never really thought about before, but they said that we're working within a system that Indigenous peoples did not create. And our answers will not solely come from that system. We have to find ways to set things right by utilizing Indigenous legal systems and the Western legal system, and our languages are going to be key in doing that. So their final message was that we are on two roads right now, and we need to find systems in which these two roads can meet in order to bridge the gap that it currently exists within our communities. And I found that I was very profoundly affected by the work that we did in talking about this concept. And it brought me home, and it brought me back to people in my community that I care about. And oftentimes, in our work, we have to be reminded about the things that are important to us. And I think for me, the value in learning about this concept was not so much talking about it in terms of how we are going to utilize reconciliation in reestablishing healthy relationships, but it reminded me the importance of going back home. And so in the work that I do now, I try to make sure that I stay grounded in the community and the people that I cherish. And I hope that the concept that came out of these discussions with the elders in my community is helpful in the deliberations over the next couple of days. I hope that it instills the kind of dialogue that I had with the elders in my community. Miigwech.
Just in terms of the work you were doing with the elders in your community, I guess I'm just curious to hear about what were some of the key steps that they thought should be taken towards, people within the community, perhaps young people, towards some of these concepts, particularly. I'm going to mess this up because I'm not Cree, but
Kwayeskatasowin.
Exactly.
Well, it was interesting because they didn't come up with steps. They said it was up to me to find the steps. And I think that what I learned was that we have a lot of the answers, I think, already in the work that we do. It's a matter of being able to bridge the two. But I think the thing that was clear to me was that we're working often in systems that are not of our own. And I'm talking about, for me, it would be a Cree or an Ojibwe system. And so it was forcing me to think about how to repair relationships in a different way. I often am drawn to the things that I'm familiar with, which is what I was taught in university, at law school, and in the work that I do. And I think that there is a lot of room to talk about how to utilize Indigenous legal systems in different ways. I mean, we have John Burroughs, who's taking his students out on the land now for law classes, which is fantastic. I think that education is going to be key in how we transform society and how we set things right. And I think that education systems from Indigenous people is going to be key to that, whether it's in a law school or in a Native Studies program. So I don't have an answer for you. I hope that maybe we can talk about that over the next couple of days.
Good morning. I just want to thank you for your presentation. It really resonated with me because I'm from a Cree background, so a lot of the concepts that you're talking about are very familiar to me. My question is about how I think some of this dialogue needs to, and I'm putting this out to the practicing lawyers in the room, we need to start thinking about how we reconcile the conflict of laws. So this framework that you're talking about is a legal framework within an Indigenous legal context. But what happens when our people are on the ground defending land or water, and they're using our own Indigenous laws to defend or protect the land, is they come into conflict with Western laws. And the same can be said about governance within Indigenous communities, using Western legal concepts, legislation, Indian Act. So when our people are challenging those systems of governance, we're running into conflict. And what happens most of the time is the Western legal systems and laws supersede our own Indigenous laws. So how do we get to a place where there's an understanding and recognition that Indigenous laws and legal orders are just as valid as these other Western legal concepts, and that a lot of the dissension, broken relationships that exist within communities and out on the land is a result of those conflicts of laws?
That's a big question.
I know. Right.
Pardon me?
My purpose in raising the question is to get people to think about that, because a lot of the legal issues that lawyers, government deal with is that conflict of laws and the non-recognition of Indigenous laws and legal orders. So how do we get this conversation moving to a place where we recognize that Indigenous laws and legal orders exist, and people are actually exercising them, but because of the process of colonization, there's a non-recognition of that. And I would say a majority of lawyers who have gone through law school, I went through law school myself, have never, this conversation is just starting. And I think that it needs to be more widespread so that there's a deeper understanding of the complexities associated with this concept that you're talking about and the Western legal concepts that our people constantly come into conflict with. So I'm just putting that out there for discussion and dialogue for people to think about.
I don't have an answer, but I have an example that I'll share with you. When I go back home and we talk about this and we practice this in our ceremonies or in our ways of dealing with dispute in the community, this fits and it's understood and it's practiced. When I take this and I go into a non-Indigenous system, a court or government sessions, it's very hard to make that work because it's not, and what the elders told me, it's not our institutions that we created. We're trying to take our legal concepts and place them into non-Indigenous institutions, and that's what's not working.
So then I guess my follow-up question to that would be, what kind of process do we need to create to facilitate those conversations so that we can get to a place where we are using our own Indigenous laws? Because when I think about the teachings from the elders and knowledge keepers that I've been fortunate to be given about our own laws and legal orders, that the restoration and the revitalization of those values, laws, concepts is what will bring us to the place of healing where our people need to go. Not labeling something Indigenous and calling it a law and fitting us into a box that is never going to work for us. So these are the kinds of conversations that we need to have. And I'm just putting this out there to challenge people in the room that are practicing lawyers, academics that do work in this area, to start to think about these things in a different way. So I'll just stop there and I'll let the next person ask the question. So I just wanted to really thank you for your presentation, because I think it's really important. Thank you.
Thank you.
In kananaskom tinoma gapi atsamuin omuta Wahkohtowin osje. I thank you for coming to share wisdom about relationships. Nistamina and mamahtanihti inoma reconciliation ka kihtamek. I've been thinking about reconciliation as well, and I don't think we finished the process of conciliation in the first place. So how can we start reconciliating something we haven't finished, like conciliation? That's one. The other thing is, kispin ka niya uyak, igwa munya uhtayak, mistahe kawanihtayak. So when we speak our oral language and we attempt to translate it into English, we lose a lot of the meanings. Becomes maybe third generation removed from the most original meaning of the word. And at its basic level, words are nothing but sounds, and sounds create vibrations, and within those vibrations there's meanings attached. Most of our words are verbs, so they make movement. So I'm in maybe this is where you could help me. I'm in this conflict that maybe Indigenous oral languages should not and cannot be translated into English because a lot of the meanings are lost, so therefore it's up to the student to relearn, and I think you mentioned that, the elders did too, to learn their language and culture, because language and culture are on two sides of the same coin. If you cannot speak your language, then you cannot practice your culture. What are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Well, I think you've just hit the nail on the head in terms of where my generation is at. The commissioners from the TRC heard that over and over again from the descendants of residential school survivors, that we don't have, a lot of us don't have the language anymore. It wasn't passed on to us. And we're seeking ways to connect with our culture, our identity. And we know that the language is critical for that. And I know that there's discussions happening across the country of how we are going to attempt to revitalize our languages. I know when I'm back home and I'm hearing about our laws in the language, I don't often understand what's being said, but I can feel what's being said, if that makes sense to some of you. I can feel what the elders are saying. And you're right, it's not just the words. When I went back, it wasn't just learning about these words and translating them. There was a whole process involved in me giving tobacco and spending time. And that's not captured in translation. So you're right, I think there's a lot of work to be done if we're going to be talking about our own legal systems and our own laws, that we work in revitalizing our languages in the way that we need to. So those are just a few of my thoughts.
Sorry, I'm Hugo Cyr from, I'm Dean of the Faculty of Political Science and Law at UQAM, and I would like to thank you very much for your talk, because I've been presiding a committee at UQAM on reconciliation, and one of the issues that I've been personally struggling with is a criticism that I've heard about the idea of reconciliation being that it is perceived as a Judeo-Christian concept, and that we are basically trying to use, again, one of our own concepts to deal with an issue that arose from the imposition of our concepts or worldviews on other people. And I'm really glad that you made this presentation, because what we need in order, whatever we call it, in this coming together, we need to hear and understand how this coming back together is perceived, conceived, and could be done from the perspective of the person or the groups that have been severely harmed by some of our past practices. So in order for reconciliation, or whatever we call it, to work, I think we really need to understand how it could be done, not only from the white perspective, but also from mostly from the perspective of those that have been hurt. So thank you very much for your talk.